Well, welcome everyone to another RIS interview where we bring you the story behind the cutting edge research that made it into our journal, the Review of International Studies. This morning, I'm thrilled to be talking to Andrea Lesser, Professor of International Relations at the University of Potsdam. Andrea has a new article in the Review of International Studies entitled "The Heart of Bureaucratic Power, Explaining International Bureaucracies Expert Authority." Welcome to you, Andrea, and congratulations on the article.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, let's get straight down to it. I'm going to start by asking you about your academic journey, how you got to this point and what brought you to this area of research.
Yeah, so it's actually a combination of personal interest and I'd say academic opportunity structure. So ever since my studies and following an internship with the United Nations, I've been interested in international organizations. And in my previous research, I have, for example, examined the organizational learning in the International Labour Organization or the dialogue of the United Nations treaty bodies with member states over compliance with human rights obligations, many other issues. And I increasingly became interested in the role of international bureaucracies. And maybe for those not familiar with the term, I refer to international organizations, administrative bodies, which are staffed by civil servants in so-called secretariats. And the most well-known example is most likely the United Nations Secretariat in New York. And so after some conceptual and empirical work on international bureaucracies, I had the opportunity to join a team of scholars who were putting a research group together. And this is called the IPA research group. IPA stands for International Public Administrations. And it's a German research group that applied for and received funding for a multi-year research project by the German Research Foundation. And I've been principal investigator of one of these projects, where I was joined with my co-authors of the RIS article, and these are Per-Olof Busch, who was then postdoctoral researcher at my chair here in Potsdam, and Jana Herold and Hauke Pfeil, who joined as doctoral researchers. And without the project and the funding, it would have been impossible to collect the data that the article builds on. And finally, the very concrete interest in the field of expert authority stems, like it is often the case in research, from engagement first with the literature. So there was this book by Michael Barnett and Martha Finmore, but many other articles and contributions where scholars argued that international bureaucracies are authorities so that they may become powerful, which means they influence national and international policies. And this is also what the title of the RIS article, "The Heart of Bureaucratic Power," actually refers to an ability to influence others by providing expertise-based recommendations. And we were very much intrigued by this idea or this notion of expert authority, but we were also curious to see if international bureaucracies actually enjoy such expert authority across the board and under which conditions this is the case. So we sought to complement existing research, mainly case study-based research, but also more quantitative analyses that capture and understand the variation in the authority that is ascribed to an international bureaucracy by a key audience, and the key audience we focus on are national ministries.
That's very interesting. So for those who don't know much about this subject, I mean, you've given us a great outline there, but perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about the ideas and arguments within the article.
Yeah, so our article is interested in international bureaucracies expert authority, and this is also why we start the article by discussing the key characteristics of the concepts. And I'd say there are two important elements. On the one hand, authority is a social and hierarchical relationship, a relationship we do not only find between ministries and international bureaucracies, but a relationship we would find in families, in schools, in the workplace, and also in international relations. So the idea is that you need to have an authority holder. In our case, this is an international bureaucracy, and you need a subordinate actor who recognizes this authority. And in our article, these are ministries. And the other important definitional element or conceptual element is that authority is a form of power. So authority addresses pay deference to an authority. And what is important here is that this deference must be based or is based on trust in certain qualities of a source, for example, in credibility. So while authority is a form of power, it is different from other forms of power that we know of and that are there in international relations, such as coercion and persuasion. And maybe as an example, what could be helpful here also to those who are not familiar or so familiar or interested in international bureaucracies is when we recall our school days, there have been teachers who advised us and we paid attention because they had said so. And we were of the opinion that the teacher is a credible source. And this is authority. And now there were other teachers who were not so credible and they had to force us to follow their advice with grades or with little punishments or whatever there has been there. So this is not authority, but rather a coercive form of power. And again, then there are other teachers who had to engage in very long arguments with the students in class. They had to deliberate to convince them again and again. And we would again argue that this is not authority either. And here, what the teachers want to tell their students is mainly only followed when they are really persuaded, and teachers have to persuade them again and again. So this is the concept. So we applied this concept of expert authority to a total of 9 international bureaucracies in the fields of global finance and agriculture. So we looked at the International Monetary Fund, we looked at the Bank of International Settlement, we looked at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the OECD, UNEP, the World Bank, the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And to find out if these international bureaucracies enjoy expert authority in the sense I've just explained the concept, we asked the heads of policy units in the ministries for agriculture or finance in 121 countries across the world. So we did an expert survey and asked them. And we found out that, maybe not surprising, some international bureaucracies enjoy more expert authority than others. So for example, the IMF is lead in the field of finance, but we also found out that the IMF's expert authority is lower in the thematic area of monetary politics than in the thematic area of tax policy and others. And we also found countries or ministerial units in those ministries where the IMF was ascribed very little expert authority only, whereas in other countries it is high. So this variation then was something that we sought to explain and exploit further. And to do this, we mainly tested 4 hypotheses that have been prominently discussed in the literature, or we derived 4 hypotheses from the literature. And these are assumptions on neutrality, the valued social purpose of an international bureaucracy, and knowledge symmetries. A lot of the work on international bureaucracies and expert authority would actually emphasize their neutrality. So it's the idea that neutrality already forms part of the mandate of an international bureaucracies, that they should act on behalf of others and not on their own, not serve their own interests, but serve the interests of the international community, and that they are only then powerful when they are impartial, that is, unbiased towards particular member states, and or when they generate and disseminate objective knowledge. So again, for the teacher analogy, does a teacher favor certain students? does the teacher privilege a certain ideology? And one would assume that bias, high degrees of bias, decrease authority, while neutrality would increase authority. So we've asked those heads of policy units how impartial and how objective they perceive the international bureaucracy to be. And we've done the same with regard to the assumption that international bureaucracies have to serve some valued social purpose, that they have to solve global problems or contribute to global problem solving. So we have tested whether it is true that ministries will rather listen to an advice or the recommendations or the outputs or take the data seriously of international bureaucracies that achieve such outputs. And we've asked them again, then the ministries, how effectively international bureaucracies address global problems. And the final test we had, or the final hypothesis we tested, the fourth one, is on potential knowledge asymmetries. So the question was, is it true that international bureaucracies possess a comparative informational advantage because they have specialized knowledge, they've been trained in a particular field, they have a lot of experience, and that they have an advantage over the ministries in the member states? And obviously, this is more true for some countries than for others. So again, we looked at the relationship. Maybe coming back briefly to this teacher analogy, the question would be, how many skills does a student actually have? And I was thinking of an example that could make this a little bit easier understandable. So imagine you are a non-native speaker and you learn a foreign language. You might look up more to the foreign language teacher than your native co-student does, who already knows the language and maybe even feels he or she knows the language better than the teacher. So we tested this assumption again. And what we eventually found is that the impartiality perceptions are least relevant. Expert authority does not rest at all on impartiality perceptions when looking at the relationship between international bureaucracies and national ministries. That's important to say. Perceived objectivity plays a role, but a much smaller role than knowledge asymmetries. And the notion that an international bureaucracy actually effectively addresses a global challenge is the most important. So in the end, what we found out is that ministries listen to those international bureaucracies whom they perceive to perform well.
So you've developed this concept of de facto expert authority, and you've explained that very well, but how is that relevant to understanding international cooperation?
Yeah, so de facto authority means that an actor recognizes the privilege of a superior actor to request a certain action, and that the subordinate actor considers, or at least follows this action, or at least considers to do what they have been asked for, or him or her has been asked for. So when the World Health Organization recommends a sugar tax that you have in Britain, we don't have in Germany, does a health ministry consider this idea because it comes from this source? So this is de facto authority, that an advice is accepted, the privilege to advise someone is accepted, and there is a willingness to consider this advice and to follow suit. And many studies previous to ours, notably those in quantitative research, have employed an understanding of de jure authority, I'd say, where they have rather analyzed whether member states have formally delegated the task to provide advice and to disseminate data and to collect data. This would then, for instance, look at whether the World Health Organization has a mandate to propose public health policies. So these are the distinctions between de facto and de jure expert authority. And we found it very important to add to the research a study on a quantitative study on de facto authority. And why is it important? Well, I'd say that both forms are important for our understanding of international cooperation. I wouldn't say necessarily the one is more important than the others. They have their advantages and disadvantages, but one could argue that the de facto authority needs to be considered more thoroughly because it may not overlap with the de jure authority all the time. And when we look at the empirics, we see that almost all bureaucracies have gained substantial mandates to provide expertise in recent years. So all international bureaucracies somehow may generate data and provide policy advice, but member states do not listen to them necessarily. So if we want to understand the crisis of multilateralism that many argue we are in a period of a crisis of multilateralism, then this difference is key, and we have to understand why some international bureaucracies become irrelevant in some countries and why they are not listened to. I would also argue that de facto authority is important if we really want international organizations to fulfill one of their core functions, such as the function to coordinate international and national policies, for example, in the current pandemic. And given that many international bureaucracies, for actually good reasons, many international bureaucracies lack coercive means. Not all can incentivize that states pay deference to their arguments or their policy recommendations. And then we have to actually understand how even those international bureaucracies who lack those coercive means can make their voices heard and fulfill this important policy coordination function in international cooperation.
Thank you. So your article is based on original data, which was based on the elite survey that you spoke about. Could you explain to us why you chose this method to study international organizations' expert authority?
Yeah, so our survey captures the extent to which international bureaucracies enjoy de facto authority among an important group of stakeholders, which are, as I have explained, ministries all over the world. And we mainly see three advantages over otherwise very valuable case study designs or other quantitative methods of data collection. So first advantage is that the survey allowed us to put the relation or character of expert authority at the center of our analysis, because we could directly ask those important group of addressees of international bureaucracies policy advice. We could directly ask heads of units in the ministries whether they ascribe expert authority to one of those 9 international bureaucracies in the different thematic areas. And we feel that this comes much closer to the actual relationship than had we inferred on expert authority by looking at the past delegation of such competences by all member states. And a second advantage, I'd argue, is that we can avoid, or it helps us, the survey helps us to avoid selection bias. On the one hand, we have a cross-sectional sample, and our sample was representative of all United Nations world regions and all World Bank income groups. So it's not just that we know about the de facto expert authority of an international organization just in one region because we had done expert interviews there or something like that. The survey also allowed us to include 9 IOs or 9 international bureaucracies. So we have much more data than had we just studied one IO, let's say the Security Council. So the third advantage, I would argue, is one where we seek to address a criticism that we actually found in the literature. Ian Hurd, for example, has warned that studies on authority fall into the problem of observational equivalence, because they cannot distinguish expert authority from other forms of power, such as coercion and so on, by simply looking at the outcome of expert authority and not knowing how the outcome came about. And because we do a survey, we can directly ask for the degree to which expert authority has been ascribed. So again, taking the student school analogy, we can ask the student why they have considered advice, or why they have followed a policy recommendation. And we can also ask for alternative forms of power, such as coercion, which we did in our survey, and then we can control for that, or look at how they are related or if they are unrelated. So that's the three advantages, I'd say.
Thank you. So for those out there who are listening to this interview, who perhaps think to themselves, oh, I want to know more, you know, I will go away and read the article, but you know, I sort of, you know, want to get the sort of main takeaways of it. Are you able to say what those are, the main takeaways of the article?
Yeah, I think we have two main, I'll do it for the main takeaways, only because you always think in your own research there are plenty of takeaways, but the two main takeaways for researchers are that international bureaucracies' expert authority comes in varying degrees or in variations, and that it is not so that an international bureaucracy either enjoys expert authority or doesn't. So the world is not black and white, the world is in gray shades. And the second main takeaway for researchers is that impartiality is less relevant for the expert authority of international bureaucracies vis-à-vis ministries, I have to say, than the research has previously expected. And we acknowledge that this could be different when other groups of addressees are coming. And I think we also have two main takeaways for the international bureaucracies, or for the practitioners themselves, who are maybe not so interested in the conceptual debate. And that is, if international bureaucracies want to get heard, they should emphasize their record as effectively addressing global challenges. This is the main important point that counts. And second, for some international bureaucracies, we also find it rewarding to present their work or their knowledge products as objective. And this is always the case when an international bureaucracy cannot coerce or incentivize, and where no other actor, any third party, pushes for deference with their recommendations. So we have some bureaucracies that can coerce and incentivize, and some bureaucracies where third parties actually push for their policy recommendations. Their objectivity does not matter. But in case the international bureaucracy cannot rely on these other forms of getting heard, then presenting the knowledge as objective, or at least we haven't measured whether they present it as objective, but we have measured whether they are perceived as being objective. Then this perception is important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for agreeing to be interviewed and giving us this really wonderful insight into your research. For those of you who would like to know more, you can read the full article on the first view section of the RIS website. If you're a BESA member, you can access this free of charge as part of your membership by logging onto your account. And if you're not a BESA member, you can see if you can gain access via your institution. And while you're here, please do look at the BESA website, www.besa.ac.uk. You can learn more about us, see all the things that we do and all the benefits a BESA membership would bring you. So that's it from me. I just wanted to say thank you, Andrea, again.
Thank you for having me.
And goodbye.
Goodbye.